Coming to you from the shores of gorgeous Lake Michigan, this is home to passionate book lovers, hosting more than 270 acclaimed authors in 14 years, including best-selling novelists Geraldine Brooks, Ann Patchett, and Mitch Albom. Welcome to the National Writers Series. Tonight, a conversation with best-selling author Kimberly Brubaker Bradley featuring her YA book, Fighting Words, with guest host Beth Milligan, lead writer and reporter at the Traverse City Ticker. The National Writers Series couldn't do this without our amazing audience, dedicated volunteers, and talented authors.
I love NWS!
We are also raising writers with Battle of the Books and free writing classes to 3rd through 12th grade students across the region.
Thank you, NWS!
A special thanks to our media partners, Interlochen Public Radio and the Traverse City Record Eagle. We'd also like to thank our other sponsors, including the Green Brick Foundation, Northgard Technology, Golden Fowler Furnishings, West Shore Bank, Ward and Mary Bevins Gillette, Cordia, and the Cherry Capital Airport. And now, introductions for tonight's event. Good evening. I'm Noelle Riley, Marketing Director for the National Writers Series. We are delighted that you've joined us. We are here with Kimberly Brubaker Bradley, who is a 2-time Newbery Honor Award winner. This is the highest honor for authors who write for youth. Tonight's show is supported by the Dilys, Garcia, Tosteson, and Lola Jackson Community Building Author Conversations. This event is also a partnership between the National Writers Series and the Traverse Bay Children's Advocacy Center. On this special evening, we want to focus on Kimberly's middle school mega award-winning novel called Fighting Words. It's a powerful book that tackles the difficult topic of child sexual abuse with sensitivity and courage. Kimberly's work has been praised for its honest portrayal of tough subjects, including abuse, foster care, and mental health issues. The book has also received numerous accolades. While the subject is intense, Kimberly incorporates elements of humor and hope, making it accessible and empowering for young readers. The novel is used by the Children's Advocacy Center to conduct nationally recognized research on how to prevent child sexual abuse. This is done by changing the social norms that allow abuse to continue. The Children's Advocacy Center is built to listen to child survivors of sexual abuse and provide them and their families with counseling. If you find tonight's content is difficult for you, the center's counselor, Kim Fleming, is available for anyone who needs to talk. Her number is 231-929-4250. Now, a little bit more about Kimberly. She's a #1 New York Times best-selling author of several middle school novels, including Jefferson's Sons and The War That Saved My Life, which was selected for the NWS Battle of the Books a few years ago, and it's an amazing read. She and her husband have 2 grown children and live with their dog, several ponies, and a highly opinionated mare. They also have a surplus of cats on a 52-acre farm in Bristol, Tennessee. Our guest host is Beth Milligan. She is the head writer for the Traverse City Ticker. She has served in marketing, board advisory, and public relation roles for numerous community organizations, including Up North Pride, Traverse Connect, Traverse City Winter Comedy Festival, the Leelanau Conservancy, and Northwestern Michigan College's Extended Education Services. Beth lives on a small hobby farm called Stonehill Farm on Old Mission Peninsula with her partner, Joe Byer. And now, please welcome Beth and Kimberly.
Hi, good evening.
Beth. And thank you, Noelle, for that introduction. I appreciate it. I'm really glad to be here. I'm sorry it needs to be virtual, but that's certainly better than people ending up in ditches. So.
It is, but we want to make sure everyone is safe, and we want to thank everyone for tuning in virtually tonight. We want to thank you for being here. We say that at every event, but tonight, truly, between the winter storm And also our topic tonight, which can be a challenging one for people, but child sexual abuse isn't easy to talk about. It's really important to talk about. And that's kind of the point of Kimberly's book. And I just want to say tonight, that Kimberly's book, which I love so much, isn't just dark. It's funny. It's inspiring. It's about sisterhood and friendship and self-empowerment and learning how to heal. So I hope our conversation tonight touches on all of those things. So Kimberly, thank you for being with us and braving the Northern Michigan weather.
Thank you very much. And I actually had a wonderful morning talking to people in the writer's studio. And, I was so hopeful we could do it live, but I'm really happy to be here.
So we're here tonight to talk about fighting words, but just to get started, I want to talk about how you got into writing YA books in general. You've written so many wonderful YA books, and Noelle shared some of those at the beginning. I read that when you were at Smith College, you took what you thought would be a blow-off education class.
Exactly.
But ended up being taught by Patricia McLaughlin, who wrote Sarah Plain and Tall. That is a book I love so much, and I'm sure some of our viewers really love too. So I'm curious what Patricia taught you and how she started on your journey as a YA author.
Yeah, I mean, the class was actually just a course for education majors for future teachers. And it was, a survey of children's literature. But it was the first time that I ever saw children's literature, first of all, as a genre you could kind of pick apart and study. But also it was the first time I ever met anybody that was a writer. I'm the first person in my family to graduate from a 4-year college. And I was raised in this house full of books, but I wasn't raised among writers. And they just sort of, it just sort of seemed like the books dropped out of the sky. Like, they appeared in the library, but they weren't really written by people. And one thing Patty did, of course, I wasn't calling her Patty at the time. I was calling her Professor McLaughlin very respectfully, but was get a lot of different authors because Northampton, Massachusetts, in that area has a lot of authors living there. And then, she would call in favors and they would come in and read things, Natalie Babbitt and Jane Nolan and a host of other people. And I started seeing it as something that could be done. It was a job. And so by the end of the semester, I had actually written a manuscript, which was frankly terrible, but inevitably, because it's a first draft from a 19-year-old. And after class, she called me up and she said, "Are you serious?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Okay, so here's a writers group that meets once a month. It's taught by Jane Yolen. You need to start going. And, do you have a car?" I said, "No." She said, "Okay, so then you need to call this person and tell her I said she has to give you a ride. And then there's a conference you need to go to and registration's closed. But if you call this person, she'll let you in. And if you call this other person and tell her you need a ride, she'll give you one."
Wow.
And so that's what really got me started and starting to think about. And then from there, so that was my sophomore year in college and I was a chemistry major. And I loved chemistry. I still do. But I started taking some of the advanced writing classes that Smith had and really learning how to not just write, but rewrite, because rewriting is the key to becoming a writer.
So then, obviously from there, it sounds like Patty, I think we can call her that, she really went above and beyond in terms of helping you with the logistics and encouraging you to do that. So then we eventually, through that journey, get to Fighting Words and, of course, many other books that you've written. So some folks watching tonight will have read Fighting Words, but some will not. And thankfully, through the Writer Series and some of our partnerships, we're able to provide free books for students and make sure folks have a chance to read this wonderful book. But in case anyone hasn't read it yet, let's just give a little bit of an overview. So if we can tell folks about Della and Suki, the sisters who are at the center of this story, maybe just a little bit about who they are and what their story is.
Yeah, so Della and Suki are sisters. The entire book is told from Della's point of view. She's 10 years old. She's a tough kid that's had a pretty hard time. And she's telling the story of what recently happened to her and Suki. When the book starts out, they are in foster care and it's a new situation. And Della's kind of relating what happened that got them there. And then at the same time, they're moving through the first couple of months after this traumatic event that's landed them in foster care and kind of working through what happens and their emotions. And so you have the story of what happened to Suki, the story of what happens to Della, and the story like kind of both current and past, all converging at once. And it sounds more complicated than it is. When you read it, Della will say, okay, let me tell you about this. Okay, now I'm going to wait and tell you this other thing later. And so that it's, I think, appropriate for a 10-year-old. You don't want to get the timelines too screwed up and expect them to follow it. But I think they can. And Suki's story is harder than Della's, but it's really only alluded to. And that was a very deliberate decision because we wanted to make this book appropriate for 10-year-olds while still very realistic about the sort of violence that some kids have to endure. And so Suki knows what happened to her, and she can kind of guess what happens to Della. And if you're a 10-year-old that unfortunately understands the situation better than you should have to, you know exactly what's happened. And if you are a 10-year-old who has no clue, it's fine. Mm-hmm. You know that it's something bad, and you're not, going to be kept awake having nightmares or woken up from nightmares about it. It's deliberately designed not to traumatize kids while still being honest about a difficult subject.
Yeah. And I mean, and you and I've had a chance to speak before. I mean, we both have personal experience with this topic. And I was very curious, honestly, going into the book, how you would handle that in an age appropriate way. And it really is so beautifully done. And there are a lot of tough, topics in this book, from, a suicide attempt to dealing with the foster system, drugs, but one, to be realistic, these are things that many kids have to encounter, unfortunately, at a young age. That is a reality. And two, I know from our conversations that you worked with professionals to make sure you got that language right, to make it age appropriate while still trying to provide some guidance of how to maybe talk about a topic like that. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that process and how you kind of work to make those topics accessible to kids.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm unfortunately unfortunately or fortunately, it's the only way I know how to do it. I'm a pretty messy writer. I go through a lot of drafts, and to some degree that's really helpful for me because I can do anything I want at the beginning drafts and make major changes and move things around. And I'm not worried about anything at all except trying to tell the story the way that I think is best. But then when you get to the end, and especially with this book, we really went through it. I like to say with a microscope and a razor blade, because we were examining all sorts of things. Now, I have a friend who is a professor of counseling. Essentially, she's teaching people to become counselors. She's now at Virginia Tech, but she read a really early draft just so I knew I wasn't completely on the wrong page with certain things. And at the end, there was another woman. Oh, I have to look up her name. I don't remember it. Who is an expert in dealing with these things, a national expert, Dr. Jennifer Hartstein. And she went through and made sure that everything that we were saying was appropriate given the situation. There's also a set of guidelines for writing for children about things like suicide, so that you're not glamorizing it and not creating a situation where it sounds appealing enough to cause copycat behavior. And so that was very important. We took those guidelines very, very seriously and went through it very carefully. And then I also took out, I didn't really ever have in them, but I made sure that we weren't using words that were going to get the book red flagged in elementary schools. So we don't have any words. We don't have the word sex. We don't have the word abuse. We don't have the word assault. We don't have any words for genitalia. And we replace every single curse word with the word snow, which I think we used 86 times. But
it's it's a very creative device because, instead of maybe saying like a-hole, she says like snowman in the book. Yeah. And I thought that was effective in two ways. One, it's funny. It's kind of something she's been taught to be more appropriate. And I think, a child who's been through trauma, I was a kid who cursed a lot. I think that's realistic. But you obviously also having a YA book with a lot of swear words in it is difficult. Yeah. And you found a good creative solution to that.
Well, and in YA, you can actually have swear words and stuff for kids older than 14. But we really wanted this to be appropriate for, the 10, 11, 12-year-old writer. And you don't want to put language that's going to keep it out of an elementary school library. So
sure. Well, I had a question about that. And so maybe this is just a good segue to ask about that, because I think there's been a movement to ban or censor books for young people based on their subject matter. Unfortunately, this is something that's been coming back a lot in the last couple of years. And your book to me really seemed like an excellent example of why young people should have access to books, even
Right.
or maybe especially on difficult topics. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on about limiting children's access to books that are seen as too difficult or too adult.
Yeah, and I have a lot of strong feelings about book banning. I live in Tennessee, which is one of the states where we've had an awful lot of challenges, and some of them are really, frankly, ridiculous. Somebody challenged the graphic novel Narwhal and Jelly, which is designed for second and third graders, which is a conversation between a cartoon narwhal and a cartoon jellyfish, on the grounds that the jelly fish was not given a gender. And that was, so they were, I guess, implying that the jellyfish was transgender. And in fact, jellyfish just don't have genitals or genders. So people take it to ridiculous, really ridiculous levels to some degree. And unfortunately, especially at the high school level, a lot of book banning, what's behind it is actually trying to remove LGBTQ and, diversity, a lot of, any book that tackles anti-Black racism, things like that, from the curriculum. It's really a censorship that's not necessary, because there already are on the books anti-pornography laws. I mean, they all exist. Pornography has a specific definition. It's not just I know it when I see it, but it also always includes the book as a whole, so that you're not cherry picking this one word. And now most of those stuff that really is banned is for high school age, and a lot of that stuff you really wouldn't put in an elementary school library. I mean, it's just not developmentally appropriate, but it's not being put in elementary school libraries. It's being, it simply is one of those things where you're fighting a problem that isn't a problem.
Yeah, and knowing that this topic of child sexual abuse is one that people generally find difficult or avoid, what inspired you to write this book, especially for a YA audience?
Well, I think it really needed, needs addressing for two reasons. I mean, and the first is it's in children's literature, we call it windows and mirrors. So a mirror is you're seeing your own situation reflected in the literature that you're reading. And that's really important for children. It lets them know that they're not alone. It lets them, and children that are the victims of child sexual assault are usually really isolated by the people that are assaulting them, who say, this is your fault, and if you tell anyone, terrible things are going to happen. And kids believe that, because this seems so foreign to them that, it must be their fault. They're kind of prone to believing that anyway, and they don't really have any way to put this into context. So letting kids see it in a book lets them know that they're not alone, and gives them the tools to start talking about it, and also to say, okay, this is wrong. This is not my fault. But there's also the windows part, where you see into a world or a situation that isn't your own. And what that really does in children's literature, and this has been proven a lot across all sorts of subject matters, is it builds empathy. You start to see these characters in stories and understand their life and feel the emotions that they're feeling and understand their situation in a way that you don't when you just read facts. And that's true for adults and kids. It's one of the best parts of storytelling, is the way we can communicate emotion. So my hope there is that, the kids will read it and they'll know that if somebody ever comes to them and says this terrible thing happened, that they will understand that it's possible. And they won't, they'll say, we have to tell a grown-up, we have to tell someone we trust, not, oh, you're lying. I've never heard of that, so it must not be true.
Yeah. And I think I had read, you'd shared in some other interviews that there, without, you haven't said specifically what happened, but you had seen something that happened in the news, and that kind of the book came pouring out of you, and described this fast and furious writing process.
It's true. I was in the middle of, and actually I know several writers who have at least found their way to a book for something similar, where I was in the middle of writing something else, and I was just really angry at something that I saw on the news, and I didn't know what to do with it, and I just sat down and started writing, and the very first thing I wrote was the very first paragraph of the book. So my new tattoo is covered by a Band-Aid, but halfway through recess, the Band-Aid falls off. I'm hanging my winter coat on a hook in our 4th grade classroom, and my teacher, Ms. Devante, walks by and gasps. Della, she says, "Is that a tattoo?" And I wasn't thinking this ahead of time. I just started writing, and I also never have the beginning when I start a book. I always have to go back and fix the beginning. But I just, I kept writing, and I wrote like 20 pages that day. And if I didn't know what would happen next, I just kind of moved down a little bit and kept writing. And by the end of the next day, I had 39 pages that was a beginning, a middle, and an end. Now, it wasn't a novel at all. I mean, it was a mess. It was really a hot mess. There were not a lot of characters. There were big gaps where I just, but it was a beginning, middle, end. And I just hit send on my poor editor, unsuspecting editor, who had no idea that I had any of this coming. And she called me up a couple of days later and said, "What the hell is this?" And I said, "I promise I will do the work. I will turn it into a novel." She said, "Okay, we're in." So
as you went through that journey, and you mentioned like it was a very kind of fast and furious writing process, which I can see, if a topic really touches someone like that coming out of you. Was your publisher, especially given the sensitivity of the topic, were they freaked out at all by the story, or were they kind of along with you for the journey?
No, I was actually, I was really surprised, because that was the thing that I said next is, I said, "Are you really in? Do I get to keep, this and this and this?" And she said, "Yeah, we're in." And I said, "Okay, great." And we, like I said, we both knew this was, I hate the word groundbreaking, but kind of, because it really hadn't been done. And we did both understand that we needed to approach it with the care that we took, so that, the ending product would be something that we could really stand behind as something that was good for kids and not harmful. But we also wanted to make it readable, something kids would want to read, not, it's not here, take your cod liver oil and have a book while you're at it. And they were phenomenal. My editor actually paid me a huge compliment. She said, "What you sent us," meaning that original 39 pages, "that was lightning in a paper bag."
Wow.
And I
a lot of confidence.
Yeah, I love that phrase. And then it was a lot of work. I mean, it went from, that flash of inspiration to now a lot of just hard work, but writing is hard work, and that's great. That's fine. And we were talking about book banning, and I will say this book has been, it has been challenged. It has not been banned. Every time it gets challenged, the people in charge read it and say, "There's absolutely nothing inappropriate about this book." So
that's good. I'm glad.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so against book banning, but I also am really pleased that when people read it, even though they're thinking, "Oh, how can we make kids read about, sexual assault?" Well, first of all, you're not. You're letting kids read about it. You're not forcing them to. One of the beautiful things about books is if kids really aren't ready for the subject, they can shut the book and walk away. This isn't anything that they, nobody is forced to continue to read a book. And I really love that about books, but it's also there for them if they need it. And a lot of them do. I wish it weren't true, but it is.
We had another author, V.A. Schwab, here for the writer series, who said the same thing, that children are really great if a book is too scary for them or too hard. They are good at setting it down for themselves and coming back to it when they're ready.
Yeah, I mean, my daughter was reading Harry Potter when she was 7, and she got halfway through number 4 and came down and said, "I want more Quidditch and less Voldemort." And I said, "You're not going to get it with that one." And she said, "Okay." And she put it on the shelf and didn't read it for 2 years. And I mean, that's great. If what you're not in the mood for, read something else. We have a lot of books in the world.
Yeah. So in the book, a therapist is talking to Della about abuse and says, maybe if more people felt they could talk about it, it wouldn't happen as often.
That's my big hope. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I actually think that's, the Children's Advocacy Center that did their study. That's their preliminary indication, is that it, being able to talk about it would have a preventative effect, which is just fantastic. I mean, you give the kids the ability, you're sort of arming them with the fact that it shouldn't happen, and you can say no. And you can tell someone. And so if something starts to happen, with any luck, they can make a big enough fuss and say no and prevent it from getting worse.
Yeah. Because the reality is that whether people talk about it or not, this, is something that's happening in our own community. The CAC, has data showing that 1 in 4 girls and 1 in about 6 to 13 boys will be sexually abused before
Right.
the age of 18. And just to put that in perspective for our audience, in a classroom of 25 kids, that's about 5
Right.
who have been or are being exploited.
Yep.
And you had a really great quote in the Northern Express this past week, which is one of our publications up here, where you said, "I think until people understand the prevalence of this problem and the amount of damage that it causes, there isn't nearly enough of an impetus to stop it because nobody is willing to talk about it."
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered if you found yourself running into that wall before, people being unwilling to talk about it, and if the book coming out has helped change that.
I'm hoping it has helped change it. One thing about this book, it came out in August of 2020, which meant that it came out during the pandemic. And so most of the time when I'm talking about a book and publicizing it around the time of its publication. And then again, it was a Newbery Honor, so that I should have gone to ALA, the American Library Association, big conference to accept the award, and there would have been a lot of stuff around that, and that was a virtual, that didn't happen. It wasn't even a virtual conference. It just didn't exist. And so I didn't spend much time out in public talking about this book, not nearly as much as I have with my other books. And I think that, I do think that some schools would rather have me come and talk about the war that saved my life. It feels safer, but at the same time, a lot of it just had to do with it coming out in the middle of the pandemic. So lately, when I've been on the road with my new book, The Night War, and over kids are coming up to me and just saying quietly, "Thank you for writing fighting words," and walking away. And that has not happened before. I've had kids say, "I love your other books," but they're not saying it loud. They're not raising their hand and waving, but they're coming up to me in the hallway and saying that, "Thank you."
Which must be an amazing feeling, I imagine.
It's an amazing feeling, and it's kind of a hard feeling, but I already knew the hard stuff. And I've had a lot of teachers that have read the book and said, "Oh, I'm just shocked to think that there could be a kid like this in my classroom." But what you just said, there's likely several. And sexual assault doesn't, it's not something that is affiliated with poverty or affiliated with a certain religion or a certain race. It's across our entire community. And so that's a really important thing to realize, that, even in a nice, what you consider, a nice, well-off, comfortable, happy, stable neighborhood, it's still something that's probably happening.
There's this thing that Reggie from the Advocacy Center calls the social flinch, which is kind of our instinct to run away or shut down when we're confronted with a difficult topic.
Yeah.
I think many of us know that when we do that, the topic doesn't go away. It usually just festers and sometimes rears its head in an uglier way somewhere else.
Yeah. And what you're teaching is any child or victim that starts to think of the topic as untouchable, is going to be much less likely to tell people. And children, it stops when they tell people. Not always, but that's the way it stops.
And because you have tackled this topic head on in your book and in any press or events you've done around it, I'm wondering if you've found some good ways of dealing with or getting around that social flinch, that initial instinct to kind of pull away from the topic.
Now, that is still a difficult one. I'm willing to talk about it. And one of the things I often do, I wouldn't do it at an event like this, but if I'm at, like last week, I was at, the National Council of Teachers of English conference in Boston. And I have a t-shirt that says "Believe Survivors." And I'll wear that for the day or something, I've got t-shirts that say all sorts of things now, but, because in a situation like that, I'm a little bit of a public figure, which I'm not most of the time. People don't recognize writers when they walk into the grocery store. It's not like you're, some sports figure or something. I'm not Steph Curry coming in, 8 feet tall, and he probably plays basketball. And oh my God, it's Steph Curry. People don't say, oh, there's, at all. But in a situation like that, I mean, just try to talk about it, and try to be a safe person that other people can talk to. The more you do that, the more people come to me now all the time and tell me their stories. And they had actually done that before I published the book. A lot of people had, just because I was willing to talk about it. So, yeah. I
mean, I think another challenge is that this is often seen as a women's issue. The majority of victims are girls and women. And of course, we want to acknowledge that there are male victims of abuse as well. But the majority of offenders are male. So men are key to this, I think, not only in addressing their own behavior, but in calling it out in others and being advocates for kids as well.
Yeah.
Reggie, again, from the Advocacy Center, told me that if men are not in this conversation, we do not change it. So I wonder what you think about that and how we can get boys and men more involved in thinking about this and addressing it.
I think we need to have some really serious conversations, starting with our kids when they're young and in school, about, what are gender norms and what are these things that are being said? Because, as far as we can tell, girls are more likely to be victims, but it's like 40%, 20 to 40% are boys, which is higher than most people think. And those boys really don't talk about it, way more than girls, because they're often assaulted by an adult male. And it, just the problems that are that it sets up in a young boy's mind are kind of overwhelming. Like they can't talk about it at all. And although I've heard some stories, but they're not used to being seen as the victim, I think, is part of it. And so, right now we've got some of that. Well, what was that horrible slogan that, some college kids were saying?
Your body, my choice.
Yeah, that one. And I just think we have to, anytime women or men hear that, especially men, especially if, fathers of daughters and sons. I mean, these are your kids that are going to be armed. You're going to have to say, why are you saying that? What are you trying to imply? What gives you the right to think that? Where do you think this is going? Is unacceptable. And I think that more and more, the more that you just call someone's comments out as unacceptable. I mean, there's all sorts of language that was acceptable when I was a kid to just, randomly use words that we would never use in polite conversation now. I mean, or impolite conversation. I mean, you just wouldn't say them casually. It would be wrong. You would understand it was wrong. I'm not going to say any of the words, but when I think back to my childhood, it's ridiculous what was said on my playground to other kids. And it's the same sort of thing. You have to stop and say, that was an unacceptable thing to say.
Yeah. And I think you do a great job in the book of demonstrating this, because you kind of show some of the different forms that assault can take. So sometimes we think about the worst case scenarios when it comes to this topic, but the truth is that our culture permits a lot of behavior that's on that spectrum, whether we were just talking about like locker room talk, boys being boys, guys joking around or catcalling women. And that, if you create that culture and make that permissible, that does often lead to worse behavior.
Yeah, I mean, you start to think that you have the right to treat another person as an object, and it does start really young. I mean, I don't have a Twitter account anymore, but I used to have something pinned at the top of mine, which was from this book, because in the book there's a side plot in Fighting Words of a kid in Della's class that is pinching girls' backs to snap their bra straps, but Della doesn't wear a bra because she's only 9 years old. Or 10 years old, and he pinches her back and calls her a baby. That was something that happened to me. And so, and that was, pretty minor, but there's I didn't even think you could complain about that as a kid. You just had to endure what these boys did, on the playground. And I had a poll of whether that had happened to people and how seriously had it been addressed. And it was really shocking. I mean, it was really pretty universal and pretty much just something that was, the girls were just told to get over it, as opposed to the boys told to stop doing it. And even in the book here, the teacher, who is not at all a bad person and really thinks, oh, she would try to take action and all, but she's shocked at the end of the book when many of Della's friends also say, no, Trevor was picking on me also. This was this whole thing that was happening to a bunch of girls in the class, and the teacher was unaware. And even though she thinks she would take action, she wasn't paying attention, and she wasn't creating an environment where the girls felt they could say something.
Yeah, I mean, I had to tell you, I had not thought about it in 30 years. And I read that scene in the book, and that did happen to me in elementary school, and it came flooding back. I can almost picture how it felt on my back to have a boy like snap your bra. Yeah. I think it is very common, and I think it is an example of, and you're right, the way it was handled in my class was very much like the kids are just roughhousing on the playground, and that's just,
but the girls are shamed.
Yeah.
And
yeah, so I agree. I think it's important to show that. And I think what you did really well in the book with that was talk about the language of consent to young readers. So Della is learning that her body is her own. No one's allowed to touch it without her permission. It doesn't matter if they're teasing or bullying. It's unacceptable. And she learns how to articulate that and to defend her boundaries. Right. And it made me wonder, because you're right, like, how I think we all grew up is maybe different than today's generation. And I'm curious what you were taught about consent, if anything, and what do you wanted to express to young readers about that?
I don't think I was taught anything about consent, to be honest with you. And I can think of times, where, when I was in middle school, that a boy said or did something that made me feel very uncomfortable. And I don't remember that I don't think it even occurred to me to say, you're not allowed to do that, let alone to say you need to ask permission before you do that. And I do think, it's changing. It's not changing as fast as I'd like. When my daughter was in college, we were on vacation at a museum, and she was very interested in looking at an exhibit, and a man grabbed her arm to push her forward because he wanted to see it. And it was not in any way sexual. But she straightened up. She's a tall person, and she straightened up and just roared, "Get your hands off me." And instantly about 30 women whip around and glare at the guy. And he's going, "Oh, well, I just was." And she was like, "No, you don't have permission to touch me." And I thought, that would never have occurred to me. And I was still a little surprised it occurred to her. And I thought it was fantastic. That's what I want any kid. Like I said, he wasn't trying to feel her up. He was just trying to push her over. And but you can't do that. You need to say, am I allowed to touch you? And
and you mentioned, in your author's notes too, but you just gave such great examples of that, and I think we are learning more about it every day, but even like, giving kids permission, like not forcing them to hug relatives that they don't want to, or you said even just asking your friend if they look sad, is it okay if I give you a hug? Right. Just saying it doesn't have to be sexual, but your body is your own, and you can learn to use that consent language.
Yeah. I was on vacation with my husband just a couple of weeks ago, and we were at a national park. Well, it was in a national park, but it was close to a national park. Anyway, there was an elderly woman that was having trouble getting up some stairs to get to the attraction. And my husband is a physician. He's trained to help people with mobility problems. And he said, "Can I help you?" And she said, "Yes, please." And he said, "Okay, I'm going to need to touch you on your shoulders. I won't touch you any lower, but I have to touch your shoulders." And she said, "Okay, that's fine." And so, I liked watching that interaction, because it wasn't assuming that if I touch you here, you're going to be fine with it. Even because you said I needed help. You might not know that that's what the help involved. You might think, no, that's a little too close to, my breast. I don't want that. And it gave, people have the right to talk about it. And not only the right, the obligation, really.
Yeah, definitely. The other thing that I thought you did well with, the bully is, in just kind of illustrating some of these lessons for kids, is the power of standing together. So sadly, predators often have multiple victims. And while each victim is going to have their own unique experience with abuse, they're going to have their own healing journey to go on, which can be a lonely process.
Yeah.
There is power in standing together. And we see that in the book when the girls stand up for each other in the classroom. But we also see it in the real world with victims, confronting everyone from Larry Nassar to Harvey Weinstein. What I loved, you said in your author's notes, I'm going to quote you here, be a wolf, take care of your pack, and fight. And I thought that was an important message, especially for girls and women, because so often we're taught not to fight. We're taught to be nice and polite.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering what you wanted girls and teens to know about fighting in a good way.
Yeah, I mean, politeness it certainly has its place. I mean, you want to know, correct table manners and that sort of thing, but it's sort of overrated, if you will. I think that one of the things that predators of children do is isolate them. They try, very much to get them kind of off in a corner by themselves. And so the more that you're not that, the more that you're part of a pack, the stronger you're going to be in the face of problems like that. I mean, I use the example of wolves going back to Yellowstone in the book. But when you watch wolves traveling together, they put the vulnerable wolves in the middle of the pack. The wolves that are traveling on the edges are the strong ones to guard the whole group. And I think if we start thinking of ourselves as a society in that terms, that we're all working together and we're all on the same team, it's going to be a helpful thing. And I think it helps girls to think about it too.
Yeah.
But boys also, again, I'm not trying to just...
Sure. Just in general, I think having strong communities can help with some of this stuff. In the book, Della says, sometimes you've got a story that you need to find the courage to tell.
Yeah.
And I wondered what advice you have, maybe for anyone who wants to write, but especially young people, about using writing to explore some of the painful stories in their own lives, maybe as a way of healing or finding some meaning to that.
Yeah. And I think that there's kind of a difference between writing as therapy and writing for publication. And I think that knowing how it can help you in your own personal healing journey is really important. I think writing as therapy has just terrific value because you can say anything and you don't necessarily have to show anyone, or you can show people if you want to. You can get it down exactly the way you want and tell them exactly the way you want to. And both of those things are really useful. I think that trying to write, I could not have written fighting words before I did. I don't think this wasn't a book I could have written in my 20s. I didn't have the writing skill. And there's a point, I think, writing for publication that you have to have reached a point in your own healing in order to tell it as a story that's something else. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Yep. To be able to separate.
So I think that both writing is a really good way, a really good therapeutic way, but I also don't think that every time you write something, you have to do it with the view of publication.
Sure. I mean, so the Children's Advocacy Center, you referred to this earlier, but has been, or Noelle did, has been using this book to study how storytelling and stories can get people to maybe engage with the topic that's difficult and think about it differently than they have previously. And I'm wondering, how you think about that, about using fiction or stories as a gateway into some of these topics we find hard to talk about in real life.
I mean, that's something that children's literature does over and over and over again. And it has been proven beneficial in terms of increasing empathy in kids and reducing their stress and, helping their brain function. I mean, sort of reducing trauma effects on the brain, if you will. So I was really pleased that the Children's Advocacy Center did a specific study on fighting words, because, again, this is a topic that really isn't discussed much in children's literature. And I know that they're trying to kind of scale that up and get more centers to do similar things to see if it's really, valid results. I was really pleased to see that it was. And I think that recognizing that you can come at difficult things in fiction is really valuable for parents too, but they've already been doing that for a lot of things. I mean, if your dog dies and you're trying to help your child go through the grief of that. There are picture books about that, that sit down and talk about your feelings. And there's just a whole lot of great topics that come across in fiction really well.
Yeah.
I kind of got lost in the weeds in that answer, and I'm sorry.
No, it's great. I appreciate it. And, I guess I'm curious overall, we alluded to this a little bit earlier, but I'm curious how you view the progress we've made on this issue in general, or if we might be in a period where we're going backwards a little bit or need to kind of work harder. Because on the one hand, in recent years, we've had the Me Too movement. We've had survivors coming forward and sharing their stories publicly. We've had, Harvey Weinstein going to jail. I think we have had a change in what's considered acceptable, like you were referring to, the kind of terminology we can use, what's okay in the workplace.
Right.
On the other hand,
right.
We have seen sexual predators elevated to some of the highest positions in politics, sports, pop culture, seemingly without consequence. I think, as we know, both being survivors know, like that itself can be traumatizing to see
Very
that
much.
it seems to be acceptable and rewarded behavior.
Right.
And we're seeing a surge in misogyny and some of those, your body, my choice comments. So how are you feeling about where we're at in this moment?
I think, I mean, the political situation is really hard. It's hard for an awful lot of women. And it's hard to see sort of a lack of humanity in some people. But I do think that among our young people, we're doing better. I think among children's and teens, we're doing quite a bit better. And I think we just have to kind of keep going to make progress. I know a lot of writers who are saying, we're not there yet, so we just have to keep working really hard.
Mm-hmm.
And the writers are the people I know. The people I know that are trying to tackle the tough issues are writers, because that's my community. I mean, there's plenty of other people in Children's Advocacy Center and all sorts of other things that are making a difference. But the writers are the way I do it.
Sure. So, and maybe we're going to have a few more questions, and in a few minutes here, we're going to go to audience Q&A. So if you are interested in asking Kimberly a question, we would love to have some questions. We'll answer as many as we can. Feel free to start putting those into the chat, because we will get to those in a few minutes. And we'd love, again, to have the audience participate in this conversation as well. So I'm going to ask just a few more questions, and we'll kick to that. So I want to talk about what we do from here. Hopefully events like this are a start, because I think the goal isn't just to catch sexual abusers, it's to stop abuse from ever happening in the first place. And a good way that we do that is making sure as many people in our community are educated about this topic as possible and are all actively advocating for our kids and watching out for them. You had some really great advice that I just wanted to pass on from your author's notes. First of all, for anyone who's experienced abuse of any age, again, the CAC is a great resource if anyone needs someone to talk to tonight or at any point. But, if you have experienced abuse, just knowing that it's not your fault, believing that it's wrong, believing that it was harmful, that you deserve help in healing. It is possible to heal, which is something I really love, a message of your book. And there are people and resources that can help you do that. And I wanted to ask you, Kimberly, if maybe you could share any advice for someone who might be a friend or family member of someone who suffered abuse and comes to them and wants to share their story or wants help. Like, how are some of the ways we can best be advocates for survivors?
Yeah, I mean, one of the very, very first things is just to believe them. And that seems to be self-explanatory, but it happens less than you would think. Believe their stories, believe that it causes harm. You'll have some people that aren't very familiar with the topic that'll just say, oh, that doesn't sound so bad. And well, it's wrong. I mean, it is bad. And it's also not your call what's bad for someone else. And so those things are important. Helping direct them toward other resources is also good, because I don't think, most of us know how to help someone heal. Believing them, listening to them is important, but also directing them to something like the Children's Advocacy Center or, the RAIN, the Rape, Abuse, Incest National Network has, a hotline, and you can call people there and they can help direct you to local resources. And, things like that are really pretty important. And Um, but I really just think that listening and believing are the most important things.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we're about to go to audience questions. I wanted to finish with a quote from an essay that you wrote for Book Page, which is really great. I just encourage people, if you just want to Google your name and Book Page and find this essay, there's so many great things in it. But you talked about how important writing fighting words was to you, and I'm going to quote here. You said, "This book means the world to me. It is, and I say this without a smidgen of exaggeration, the book I was meant to write, the work I was put on this earth to do. Fighting words was the hill I was willing to die on, but I didn't die. I bloomed." I thought that was such a beautiful quote, and I think it really summarizes what tonight is about, that healing is important, sharing our stories is important, and fighting for ourselves and for each other is important. So I'm so glad that you wrote this book and that you have been here with us tonight to discuss it. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an amazing essay. So I think if we want to go to the audience Q&A, we've got some folks behind the scenes here who can help.
Great.
Cue that up for us.
How do parents detect it? Okay, so a couple of things. I mean, anytime your child suddenly is acting very different, I think that would be an important thing to notice. And to realize that if you say to your kid, "Did something bad happen to you?" there's a very good chance they're going to say no. And that doesn't mean nothing bad happened. You kind of have to persist a little. I had a friend who told me once about, her parents said after someone that they knew had been, they'd become aware that someone that they knew was a predator, and they said, "Did this person ever hurt you?" And my friend said no. And she said she remembered walking away, looking at the tops of her shoes and thinking, "Ask me again, ask me again."
Mm-hmm.
But her parents didn't ask her again. But, she had been a victim. It's just, she wasn't in a place where she could talk about it yet. So that is important. I think you do have to be really careful about adults that you don't know well. Especially any adult that's doing one-on-one time with your kid. And I know that sounds kind of harsh, but my husband was a basketball coach for years, and I went to all the practices because we needed him not to be alone with the kids. I mean, it's just kind of a good safety thing. And so the number one person that's likely to abuse your kids is someone that you're dating. So, especially single moms, and it's, that because that's an easy way to get to a minor kid.
And I think it's, it's obviously a balance that we don't want to try to operate in our lives with this like suspicion that everyone's a predator, but also the reality that some are, or some are willing to be.
Being aware that it can happen. I mean, and then, if a child tells you, "I don't want to go back to that babysitter," they don't go back to that babysitter, as far as I'm concerned. And that was always, I mean, my kids probably didn't even know this because, but, they said, "I didn't really like the babysitter." They never had that babysitter again. I didn't, any kind of uneasy feeling, we were out. So, and it, you might have some very nice people that don't get to babysit your kids then, but that's much better than having your kid harmed because you weren't, you were sure it couldn't happen to them.
Yeah. And I think, just an example from Larry Nassar on, we have so many examples in our society where, people in positions of authority, whether they're, and often positions where they're really likable, and maybe it's even a difficult because it's a school structure or a church structure, like youth pastors, youth ministers.
He's such a fine person. But, what actually brought Larry Nassar down was he harmed two girls that were not trying to be Olympic gymnasts. And he didn't have power over them.
Yeah. So being aware of those power dynamics is
it was really a power dynamic, because the girls that wanted to be on the Olympics team, he was held up so much by the powers that be on the Olympic committee that they felt like they couldn't, that they didn't have any way of fighting him. But he came after some kids that weren't going to be Olympic gymnasts and had no aspirations. And those are the ones that started the whole thing.
Yeah, and I'll ask another question here too. I'll just say too, just a quick editorial aside from me, this is just my own opinion, but one good way to do that too is to have more women in your power structures.
Oh, very
So
much so.
having
Yeah.
women in your leadership structures,
Yeah.
I just think when you have unchecked male power structures, it often creates dynamics that are not healthy in a lot of ways. So we have a question here. Do you envision this book being as JFIC or YA?
So JFIC is juvenile fiction, or YA is young adult. I see it as juvenile fiction. It was designed for grades 4 through 7, and that's what I see it as. YA to me starts at really grade 9. Some people will say grade 8, and I do think that the book is still readable by people of any age, and I think it's enjoyable. I hope. I mean, that's the point of the book, and also, you ought to be able to get something out of it. But the main character is 10 years old, and she has a 10-year-old perspective, and so that really is a juvenile fiction.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so what was the most powerful part of the process in writing the book?
I think for me, it was because I really was angry when I started the draft, and feeling like I didn't need to pretend I wasn't angry, and didn't need to downplay being angry. I just needed to channel being angry. And that was something new. And I think that it was something that for me was very powerful. And feeling like I finally had the craft and skill to tell this book the way I wanted to tell it.
You know what's so interesting about that is that I see that reflected in Della, because she has anger issues, as of course a child in her situation would be in the book, and I related to it so much. And she, I loved her because she's such a fighter, and but she originally, that anger is coming out in these sort of kind of violent ways, and she's trying to fight for herself and push back, but hasn't been really learned your language of learning to not necessarily deny, but channel your anger in a healthy way. Because I think for women and girls, I need to be reminded that anger is usually your body's way of telling you that something is not right, that you need to do something to protect yourself. But learning how to not sublimate it, but how can you express it in a healthy way to still stand up for yourself? Della learns how to do that in the book.
Yeah.
Which I thought is great.
Not just punching people either.
Not just punching people, but using
there might be the time to punch people, but in general, you can't just walk down the street punching people. So,
Right. So using your words and learning how to stick up for yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So I think we have another question. This is such a difficult topic. How do we open conversations? How do we open conversations about this?
Read the book. Give it to your kids. Read it with your kids. I've had people I know who gave the book out because I wrote it, and then had to family members, who then had family members say, "This happened to me." Not, and I'm trying to be vague there on purpose, because I'm not trying to out anybody, but just that you don't really know what anyone else has experienced. But this, if you read this, and especially if you sat down and read it out loud to your kids, or you listen to the audiobook, this is a good opening into the topic in a way that is designed not to overwhelm kids, so that it is something that you could sit down and talk about it with your kids with. And I think that that's really important. And I think that parents being willing to do that are going to really arm their kids both with the permission to talk about difficult stuff, and also the trust with their parent, that their parent is someone they can come to with difficult things.
Yeah. And I think, again, that, if we have that flinch reaction, or this is something we not talk about, I think especially in past decades, a lot of children were taught, like, don't say anything, don't kind of rock the boat, and and were denied that, and they never talked about it again until someone maybe later gave them language to do that. Do you have any resources, Kimberly, that you recommend for teaching body safety? I do think your book does a great job about consent, but I'm curious if you came across anything else.
There are plenty of books for younger kids. I'm not sure that a title will come to mind right now, but there are lots of picture books now that are about consent, and they really are just very straightforward. I mean, this is your body, here's who's allowed to touch what parts of your body, yeah, I mean, I think that they exist. I don't know the titles, and I wish that I did.
Sure, it's okay.
But I'm not going to make something up.
So another reader asked, my 11-year-old daughter asked, what is your favorite character in the book and why?
I really think Della, because she just, once I was really writing her, it was so much fun to just, the way, her voice, there's one part where she just says, yeah, like, I completely believe everything these government people tell me, and then just moves on. And one of the reviewers called that out as saying it was hard to believe that you could have this snarky 10-year-old where you realized she was being sarcastic, but it wasn't drilled home. It was just a comment she made in passing, and then kept going. And writing that was just a lot of fun. I mean, she just had a lot of funny things to say. The other thing that was actually really cool for me is this book is set in my hometown. And I grew up in Indiana, but I moved to Upper East Tennessee 27 years ago, almost 28. And it's been my home ever since. And this is the first book that captures the voice of the people that live there, that I really think is from that area. And I'm proud of that.
I think it was maybe in the book page essay, but you talked about how you sort of saw your younger self, your little girl inside of you, sort of playing with Della and connecting with these girls. And I think that's like, I felt that when I read the book. I think when you grow up as a survivor, if you've healed and processed from it, you feel this motivation to wish you could go back and protect the little person that you were. And to try to do that for little people now.
Yeah, be the person that stood up for that kid. Absolutely.
The person that stood up for them when people weren't then. Yeah. So I think we have another question. What is the next book that you're working on?
So after Fighting Words, I did write a short biography of Rosalind Franklin, which most people don't know about. But then my next major novel was called The Night War, and it was released in April, and it was about the Holocaust. So we have sexual assault and the Holocaust. So the book that I just finished a draft of is about ponies. It is a funny, cheerful book about a bunch of kids and some horses. And it's just kind of me taking a break from trauma. It was so much fun to write. And so I was, and now we'll move on, I'm sure, to more serious stuff, but it doesn't have a title yet, but.
I was going to say, so that one hasn't come out yet.
It doesn't have a title, and it also doesn't have a release date yet. I just finished what we hope is close to the final draft. But So pretty soon, I hope we'll get a release date, but we don't know one yet.
Great. So people can keep an eye out for that. So I think as we wrap up here, thank you to everyone who submitted such great questions tonight. Thank you again to the Traverse Bay Children Advocacy Center for being a partner in this event. This is a comment that we had in our chat. Thank you from the team at Lakeshore Children's Advocacy Center. This book is powerful and important and so necessary. I agree. And I want to thank the National Writer Series for having both of us tonight and for having this conversation, because again, sometimes these things are tricky and it's not the same as like, an easy night on the town, but it is so, so important. And I want to thank you again, Kimberly, for being here tonight and taking the time to talk about this.
Hugely appreciate the National Writers Series taking this on, inviting me to talk specifically about this book. It meant a lot to me. I'm sorry we had to do it by Zoom, but really, really have enjoyed my time. Thank you.
Well, we've really enjoyed having you here. Thanks for everyone for being here tonight. There are free copies of this book, especially for students. So you can get those at Horizon Books. And the final National Writers Series event of 2024 is coming up in a couple weeks. So go to the nationalwriterseries.org if you want to learn about that. If you're a Lions fan, you don't want to miss that one. That'll be an exciting one. And thank you again, Kimberly. Thanks to everyone for being here tonight.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for joining us. Up next is Bill Morris and his book, The Lions Finally Roar, Wednesday, December 18th. Get in-person and virtual tickets at nationalwriterseries.org.